The Famous Five by Enid Blyton. Book 1. 5 on a Treasure Island. Chapter 11. Off to Kirene Island. Julian and George went to find Dick and Anne. They were waiting for them in the garden, looking upset. They were glad to see Julian and George and ran to meet them. Anne took George's hands. "I'm so sorry about your island, George," she said. "So am I," said Dick. George managed to smile. "I've been acting like a girl," she said, half ashamed, "but I did get an awful shock." Julian told the others what they had planned. "We'll go tomorrow morning," he said. "We'll make out a list of all the things we shall need. Let's start right now." He took out a pencil and notebook. The others looked at him. "Things to eat," said Dick at once. "Plenty, because we'll be hungry." "Something to drink," said George. "There's no water on the island, though I think there was a well or something years ago that went right down below the level of the sea and was fresh water. Anyway, I've never found it." "Food," wrote down Julian, "and drink." He looked at the others. "Speds," he said solemnly, and scribbled the word down. Anne stared in surprise. "What for?" she asked. "Well, we'll want to dig about when we are hunting for a way down to the dungeons," said Julian. "Ropes," said Dick. "We may want those too." "And torches," said George. "It'll be dark in the dungeons." "Ooh," said Anne, feeling a pleasant shiver go down her back at the thought. She had no idea what dungeons were like, but they sounded exciting. "Rugs," said Dick. "We'll be cold at night if we sleep in that little old room." Julian wrote them down. "Mugs to drink from," he said, "and we'll take a few tools too. We may perhaps need them. You never know." At the end of half an hour they had a long list, and everyone felt pleased and excited. George was beginning to recover from her rage and disappointment. If she had been alone and had brooded over everything, she would have been in an even worse sullen temper. But somehow the others were so calm and sensible and cheerful. It was impossible to sulk for long if she was with them. "I think I'd have been much nicer if I hadn't been on my own so much," thought George to herself as she looked at Julian's bent head. "Talking about things to other people does help a lot. They don't seem so dreadful then. They seem more bearable and ordinary. I really like my 3 cousins. I like them because they talk and laugh and are always cheerful and kind. I wish I were like them. I'm sulky and bad-tempered and fierce, and no wonder Dad gets cross with me and tells me off so often. Mom's lovely, but I understand now why she says I'm difficult. I'm different from my cousins. They're easy to understand and everyone likes them. I'm glad they came. They are making me more like I ought to be." This was a long thought to think, and George looked very serious while she was thinking it. Julian looked up and caught her blue eyes fixed on him. He smiled. "Penny for your thoughts," he said. "They're not worth a penny," said George, going red. "I was just thinking how nice you all are, and how I wish I could be like you." "You are nice too," said Julian surprisingly. "You have just been on your own a bit too much, that's all. I think you are a really interesting person." George flushed red again and felt pleased. "Let's go and take Timothy for a walk," she said. "He'll be wondering what's happened to us today." They all went off together, and Timothy greeted them at the top of his voice. They told him all about their plans for the next day, and he wagged his tail and looked up at them out of his soft brown eyes as if he understood every single word they said. "He must feel pleased to think he's going to be with us for 2 or 3 days, said Anne. It was very exciting the next morning, setting off in the boat with all their things packed neatly at one end. Julian checked them all by reading out aloud from his list. It didn't seem as if they had forgotten anything. "Got the map?" said Dick suddenly. Julian nodded. "I put on clean jeans this morning," he said, "but I remembered to put the map into my pocket. Here it is." He took it out and the wind blew it right out of his hands. It fell into the sea and bobbed there in the wind. All 4 children gave a cry of utter dismay. Their precious map! "Quick, row after it," cried George, and swung the boat round. But someone was quicker than she was. Tim had seen the paper fly from Julian's hand and had heard and understood the cries of dismay. With an enormous splash, he leapt into the water and swam valiantly after the map. He could swim well for a dog, for he was strong and powerful. He soon had the map in his mouth and was swimming back to the boat. The children thought he was a hero. George hauled him into the boat and took the map from his mouth. There was hardly the mark of his teeth on it. He had carried it so carefully. It was wet, and the children looked anxiously at it to see if the dressing had been spoiled. But Julian had dressed it very strongly, and it was quite all right. He placed it on a seat to dry and told Dick to hold it there in the sun. "That was close," he said, and the others agreed. George took the oars again, and they set off once more for the island. Getting a shower from Timothy when he stood up and shook his wet coat, he was given a big biscuit as a reward and crunched it up with great enjoyment. George made her way through the rifts of rocks with a sure hand. The others thought it was amazing how she could slide the boat in between the dangerous rocks and never get a scratch. They thought she was really wonderful. She brought them safely to the little inlet and they jumped out onto the sand. They pulled the boat high up in case the tide came far up the tiny cove and then began to unload their goods. "We'll carry all the things to that little stone room," said Julian. "They'll be safe there and won't get wet if it rains. I hope nobody comes to the island while we are here, George." "I shouldn't think they would," said George. "Dad said it would be about a week before the deeds were signed, making over the island to that man. It won't be till then. We have got a week anyhow." "Well, we don't need to keep a watch then," said Julian, who had half thought that it would be a good idea to make someone stay on guard at the inlet to give a warning to the others in case anyone else arrived. "Come on, you take the speds, Dick. I'll take the food and drink with George, and Anne can take the little things." The food and drink were in a big box, for the children did not mean to starve while they were on the island. They had brought loaves of bread, butter, biscuits, jam, tins of fruit, ripe plums, bottles of ginger beer, a kettle to make tea, and anything else they could think of. George and Julian staggered up the cliff with the heavy box. They had to put it down once or twice to give themselves a rest. They put everything into the little room. Then they went back to get the collection of blankets and rugs from the boat. They arranged them in the corners of the little room and thought that it would be very exciting to spend the night there. "The two girls can sleep together on this pile of rugs," said Julian, "and we two boys will have this pile." George looked as if she didn't want to be put with Anne and classed as a girl. But Anne didn't wish to sleep alone in her corner, and she looked so pleadingly at George that the older girl smiled at her and made no objection. Anne thought that George was getting nicer and nicer. "Let's get down to business," said Julian, and he pulled out his map. "We must study this really carefully and work out exactly where the entrances to the dungeons are. Now, come around and let's do our best to find out. It's up to us to use our brains and beat that man who's bought the island." They all bent over the traced map. It was quite dry now, and the children looked at it earnestly. It was plain that in the old days the castle had been a very grand place. "Look," said Julian, putting his finger on the plan of the dungeons. "These seem to run all along under the castle, and here are some marks that seem to show steps or stairs." "Yes," said George, "I think they are. It looks as if there are two ways of getting down into the dungeons. One lot of steps seems to begin somewhere near this little room, and the other seems to start under the tower there. What do you think this thing is here, Julian?" She put her finger on a round hole that was shown not only in the plan of the dungeons, but also in the plan of the ground floor of the castle. "I can't imagine what that is," said Julian, puzzled. "Oh yes, I know what it might be. You said there was an old well somewhere. Do you remember? Maybe that's it. It would have to be very deep to get fresh water from under the sea, so it probably goes down through the dungeons too. Isn't it exciting?" Everyone thought it was. They felt thrilled and happy. There was definitely something to discover, something they had to discover within the next day or two. They looked at one another. "Well," said Dick, "what are we going to start on? Shall we try to find the entrance to the dungeons? The one that seems to start round about this little room? For all we know, there may be a big stone we can lift that opens above the dungeon steps." This was a thrilling thought, and the children jumped up at once. Julian folded up the precious map and put it into his pocket. He looked round. The stone floor of the little room was overgrown with creeping weeds. They had to be cleared away before it was possible to see if there were any stones that looked as if they could be moved. "We'd better get to work," said Julian, and he picked up a spade. "Let's clear away these weeds with our spades, scrape them off, look like this, and then examine every single stone." They all picked up spades, and soon the little stone room was full of a scraping sound as the four of them chiseled away at the close-growing weeds with their spades. It wasn't very difficult to get the stones clear of them, and the children worked quickly and eagerly. Tim got most excited about everything. He hadn't any idea at all what they were doing, but he joined in valiantly. He scraped away at the floor with his 4 paws, sending earth and plants flying high into the air. "Tim," said Julian, shaking a clod of earth out of his hair, "you are being a bit too enthusiastic. You'll send the stones flying into the air too in a minute. Isn't it great the way Tim joins in everything? How they all worked, how they all longed to find the entrance to the underground dungeons. What a thrill that would be!"